Hi, I am Danielle Glassmeyer from Bradley University, and my paper is on erasing the childhoods of Indigenous children at BIA boarding schools. The paper is drawn from a monograph in progress that focuses on debates, strategies, and policies that have been organized over time by dominant U.S. cultural voices to intervene on behalf of what I'm calling other people's children. These interventions advertise themselves as propelled by benevolent impulses, seeking to ameliorate injuries to the children. Yet the reason these ameliorations are needed in the first place is because these injuries were inflicted by dominant U.S. forces. Today, I'll be focusing on the example of the United States Bureau of Indian Affairs federal boarding school system as the focal intervention by the dominant U.S. culture. I'm going to reframe that intervention as an effort to erase the childhood of Indigenous students. I'll look briefly at the ways in which the school structure was designed toward this erasure, and then I'll try to demonstrate how popular representations of Indians contribute to this erasure. And finally, I'll give a tiny peek at how some of the children at Carlisle School resisted. Richard Henry Pratt, pictured here, founded the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in 1879. As a lieutenant during the Indian Wars, he was assigned in 1875 to transport and guard surrendered prisoners of war, adult men from the Kiowa, Comanche, Cheyenne, and Arapaho nations to Fort Marion, Florida. He educates them instead of simply imprisoning them, and his experiments with adult students lead him to suppose that securing the Indians as children and separating them completely from their home cultures would lead to full assimilation of Native peoples into American life. Pratt's career-long mantra coheres with what's on the slide. He proposed that killing the Indian in him, in the Native people, would result in saving the man. Carlisle and the 25 federal off-reservation boarding schools and hundreds of other BIA-supported schools worked assiduously toward this goal, specifically by replacing native languages with English, by compelling the adoption of Christian, civilized, and American practices and beliefs, and teaching trades, usually agricultural, that would enable graduates to leave the blanket and to assimilate into the dominant culture. In Changed Forever, Arnold Krupat studies scores of narratives by survivors of BIA boarding schools to determine the common threads between them. Consistency of locus, and topos across dozens of narratives give insight into how systematic the disciplinary methods were that were used to break ties to home and to foster assimilation. For instance, replacing the children's given names with Christian names disrupts and reorients belonging away from distinct traditional practices and toward integration into American social systems. But it also severs the children from the siblings and the relatives who call them by their given name, the parents and elders who gave the name. Identity may be altered, but their childhood is erased. Haircutting and communal scrubbing break traditional ties and enforce the notion that traditional practices are dirty or defective. But especially with haircutting, these hygienic practices discard an entire lifetime of literal growth. Living by the bell, the regulation of students' waking moments through clock time, breaks rhythms of sunlight and season, but it also breaks the human interactions, verbal corrections or encouragements, and the relationships that regulate a child's day. Pratt eagerly documented this erasure through commissioned photos that were used as fundraising tools to influence legislation and to model desired change to the students themselves through the school's internal publications. Pratt commissioned John Nicholas Choate, a photographer, who produced hundreds of before and after photos of Carlisle students. Both of the photos in this set are from 1880, and they show how aprons and pinafores for the girls, along with straw hats, and haircuts for the boys, along with military-looking uniforms, and the introduction of a swing, all combine to produce a regulated gender order as the girls now sit and the boys stand with hands placed possessively on or near the girls. This set of Tom Torlino in 1882 on the left and 1885 on the right, sources suggest that Choate would stage his subjects with lighting, props, and costumes to make them appear more savage before, more civilized after. In this example, the regulation of hair, clothing, the removal of jewelry, and the lightened skin tone suggest that Carlyle has worked to transform an exotic youth into a conventional man. Now, education may always strive to move children away from childhood and to regulate them into readiness for adult life. However, the operation on Indigenous children of boarding schools was that much harsher because, as I'll argue in this time ahead, print media's obsession with Indigenous adult warriors created a vacuum in which Indigenous childhood is erased. For the many readers of popular magazines, even children's magazines, there was no such referent as an Indian child. My sample images suggest that between 1814 and 1861, Indian children as children do appear, albeit increasingly problematically, in publications. This first is a facsimile of a story originally published in 1814. The Hunters, or the Sufferings of Hugh and Frances in the Wilderness, offers itself as a true story in which two youths, both young boys, students at Dartmouth, Hugh, who's white, and Frances, who's native, go hunting for meat for the school. Hugh carries his knife unsafely and is seriously injured. There's a big snowstorm that makes transporting Hugh difficult, so Frances cares for Hugh's wound, hunts for and feeds Hugh, and as depicted here, literally carries him on his back to school over several days, all while regulating his own and Hugh's robust prayer schedule. The Bible Boy is an 1845 publication of the American Sunday School Union. It's a conversion and rescue story in which Joseph Reed, who's so named the Bible Boy, is taken captive and converts native boy Lightfoot, who has fortunately already learned to speak English. Lightfoot then assists Joseph's escape and eventually becomes a missionary to his own people. In this image and page from 1861 by prolific children's literature writer Jacob Abbott, protagonist John True visits curiosities, including this family of, quote, savages in their wigwam. The text instructs young readers that unlike, quote, a boy or girl of our race, close quote, it is the savage children's nature to sit in a wigwam doing nothing all day. Their baby sibling is dubbed, quote, the most curious object in the wigwam, close quote. Images and imaginings of Native children become a lot rarer when the focus on religion is removed. As an example, here the child's picture book, published by Rufus Merrill, groups together exotic peoples from around the globe with North and South American Indians. Consistently, the illustrations of North American Indians show adult men, most in war gear, holding weapons. Pawnee Brave, who you saw from the other page, like his cohort, appears in a section that Merrill calls Indian Anecdotes. While this section of the book contains 4 stories of kindness shown by so-called savages to white people, each story is illustrated by an image of a warrior, and there are no children depicted in the entire book. In the Book of 100 Pictures, Japanese people drink tea, Dutch people stand near windmills. Many cultures are depicted. But unlike the cultures that precede and follow them, readers learn that the wild Indians, I'm quoting, are a savage and wild people and fond of fighting. But we hope they will soon be taught to live in peace and love, close quote. So well before Carlisle opens in 1879, Indigenous children have virtually disappeared from children's books. Between 1890 and 1903, Harper's Magazine and Harper's Weekly published at least 32 illustrations by Frederick Remington, of which these are a small sample. The illustrations consistently depict adult men, braves in traditional dress, often with weapons, even as the U.S. government declares Native peoples to be pacified. In the original publication, in the magazines, each of these images is paired with stories that correlate fairly well with the image. In 1923, however, when Hamlin Garland's The Book of the American Indian is published by Harper and Brothers, the publisher chooses Remington's illustrations to decorate the book. This is shocking because Garland had compiled stories that focused intensely on the love that binds Native American families, immersing readers in the painful decisions and accommodations that capable and loving leaders and parents make to deal with the encroachment of white dominance. His stories clearly remind readers that there are children and families in the places where Remington's illustrations would suggest there are only savages. I'll give one example from Garland's stories. The Iron Kiva recounts how the Pueblo people have adjusted themselves to being compelled to sending their children to a local missionary school. Yet, as shown, the first image by which readers are asked to picture the tale shows a cowpuncher visiting a village somewhere on the plains. In the story, the U.S. Army is called in to force families to send their children east to boarding schools. The 2 boys chosen to be sent run away and take their own lives rather than leave their families. The pain of separation is the story's point, as its last line zooms in on the, quote, stricken mothers who sat with haggard faces and unseeing eyes, close quote. But the accompanying image of an Apache warrior on horseback taking aim at an approaching stagecoach tells a very different tale. The dissonance is powerful, and if pictures are worth 1,000 words, readers would likely find Garland's empathetic message overpowered by Remington's representations of a warrior culture that had been effectively wiped out a generation earlier. In this gap, this erasure, there are voices that pushed back as reminders that these were families and these were children who were compelled to cross hundreds of miles to attend boarding schools Luther Standing Bear's and Gertrude Bonnen's stories of Indian childhood are two of the most famous examples. But what I'll end with is this. Even while at the school, the children at Carlisle left traces that suggest that the total institution that was Carlisle did not squash every spark of childhood. The traces are found in textbooks that the children at Carlisle were assigned: a book of patriotic songs, a history book, a book about the human body. In Mace's history reader, pictured here, a history that is as bereft of children as could be imagined, the children of Carlisle insist on their presence by inscribing their names, as shown sometimes in pen and sometimes in red. While I'm not sure I have found the right Susie P., and I can't find Charles L. Miller, Miss Ethel Bear's Ear attended from 1917 to 1918. And it may have been her who wrote to Porfirio Quellar, "Dear sweetheart," in red, "how is your heart? I hope it is fine and dandy." In Lessons on the Human Body, you can see in the middle panel, just barely detect a name that's been erased, with Lillian Smith's name above and Hattie Jameson's name legible below. But for my final word today, instead of a conclusion, oh, sorry, I skipped a bit. In other places in the book, Maud, Emma, Annie, and Julia announce their presence. But for my final word today, instead of a conclusion, I'm going to end with a sense of playful haunting. The same human body textbook that so many students had imprinted their names on has a frontispiece that features a skeleton. The skeleton has been, kind of like the John Choate photos, tamed with props and modified by some child who had the textbook assigned to them. In a mashup that I can't decode, the skeleton is dressed in a straw boater and then contained with a caption that maybe dubs it as the Holy Ghost, or maybe calls on the Holy Ghost for protection from it. In either case, the image, combining random elements of an education meant to make native children disappear, gives testimony to some unnamed child's presence, who claims, via the skeleton and across time, I was here.